This channel has already profiled one unique American businessman, Ralph Lauren. He was singled out for his pioneering recognition of the power of branding and how to increase it through, among many other things, costume design for major Hollywood movies. This time, we want to talk about another unique American, John Davidson Rockefeller Sr., 1839 to 1937, who became one of the richest Americans ever. Some say he was the richest. Others claim he was also one of the richest people in the entire history of the world. He's often called the first billionaire. After his death in 1937, his personal fortune was estimated at $1.4 billion in the money of those times. That was about 1.5% of the entire GDP. That's gross domestic product, or in plain language, the total wealth of America at the time. His wealth was equivalent to about $29.2 billion today. That doesn't seem so impressive. It is, for example, only a fraction of the net worth of Bernard Arnault, the French boss of the LVMH luxury goods empire. He tops the current Forbes magazine list of the world's billionaires with a fortune estimated of $210.8 billion. However, Arnault's wealth needs to be put into context. It's only about 0.007% of the estimated total GDP of France in 2024. In other words, Rockefeller's wealth was so great that he dominated the American business scene of his time. Rich as he is, Monsieur Arnault doesn't have that towering economic status, not even close. In all of history, only one other person could make a similar claim. He lived more than 2,000 years ago, and his name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, 115 to 53 BCE, a Roman real estate investor, statesman, and general. He put down the slave rebellion led by Spartacus and was portrayed as Laurence Olivier in the 1960 movie with that title. Obviously, any data from so long ago are hard to verify. However, the Greek biographer Plutarch claimed that the Crassus fortune was the equivalent of 1 year's revenue for the entire Roman Empire. Definitely, therefore, Crassus is a strong contender for the title richest person of all time, but his candidacy was pretty much impossible to prove one way or the other, so we'll stick with John D. How did he get to be so rich? He was from humble beginnings, although not especially poor, raised as the second of 6 children in a small home in Richford, New York. His father, William, nicknamed locally Big Bill or Devil Bill, was a traveling salesman, hustler, and confidence trickster. One of his main activities was selling quack medicines and so-called elixirs to the sick and desperate. It seemed that he concocted the fake remedies himself. He was hardly ever home. Indeed, he never returned there after 1855, when John D. was just 16. He'd gone to live with his other wife and their children. 2 years prior, the family had moved to Ohio. His mother Eliza was therefore the main influence during his formative years. He was a devout Baptist, thrifty by nature, and in Big Bill's frequent absence by necessity. As John D. said later, he was taught to work, to save, and to give. His Christian faith was integral to his daily life and character. Looking back later, he believed it to be the foundation and source of his success. Another characteristic that served him well was his methodical, studious, and serious nature, remarked upon by several contemporaries. Not one for small talk, jokes, or banter, he expressed himself clearly, succinctly, and precisely. As we noted in our video about what it takes to make your first $1 million, the most essential trait for reaching that goal is focus. Rockefeller was the epitome of focus. He exercised that Ron Chernow, his biographer, called an eerie level of self-control. The man himself put it another way: "I would rather be my own tyrant than have someone else tyrannize me." What that meant was that in order to be his own boss, it was first necessary to become boss of his own self. Perhaps because of the unreliability of his father as a source of income and support for his family, Rockefeller seems to have determined from an early age that he would devote himself to the business of making money. As a youth, he's reported to have said that his 2 main ambitions were to make $100,000, around $3.6 million in today's money, and to live until he was 100 years old. So, While he was still in high school in Ohio, he enrolled in a bookkeeping course. Not only was that subject likely to have appeared in his innate sense of order, it gave him an understanding of the proper management and, above all, the control of money. In 1855, age 16, he completed the course and left high school. Almost immediately, he gained his first job as an assistant bookkeeper at a small Cleveland firm. It was a produce commission merchant. It was an intermediary between, on one side, farmers and produce of agricultural goods, and on the other, the wholesale and retailers who distributed and sold their products. He loved the work, putting in long hours and delighting, he said later, in learning about the methods and systems of office work and the overall conduct of business. He developed a particular interest in tracking and minimizing costs, especially for transportation. After 4 years in 1859, he joined two partners in starting their own produce commission business. Now 20 years old, he'd already saved $800 and put that into the new firm, along with a further $1,000 borrowed from his father. That loan also indicates that much as he despised Wild Bill's loose and callous way of life, John D. was very much indebted to his father. Literally so, because the loan carried an interest rate of 10%. The new firm, called Clark Gardner & Company, in which Rockefeller was the junior partner, thrived from the very start. It made a profit in its first year. Then the start of the Civil War in 1961 caused profits to soar because the Union Army needed enormous amounts of food and supplies, as Napoleon was reputed to have said, "An army marches on its stomach." However, as the war dragged on, Rockefeller noticed how military demand had driven up the price of crude oil dramatically. In response, thousands of speculators joined the new rush for this black gold. Mainly, it was refined into the kerosene widely used for lighting in those pre-electric days. John was tempted to join those speculators. He saw the way to prosper was to offer downstream oil products that served the development, expansion, and diversification of the overall industry. That was why, in 1863, Clark Gardner & Company opened an oil refinery in Cleveland. Unlike other refineries, however, this one didn't just dump the 40% of crude feedstock left over after being turned into kerosene. Rather, it used some of the kerosene to powder itself and turned the rest into lubricating oil, paraffin wax, tar, naphtha, and other products. Also, Rockefeller applied what he'd learned about cost control in his first job. For example, he hired his own plumbers to build pipelines at half the price charged by independents. He also used his own coopers to make oil barrels at less than half the usual cost. In 1864, John married Laura Spellman after claiming, "Her judgment was always better than mine. Without her keen advice, I would be a poor man." Civil War, as the great westward expansion of the USA got underway. Rockefeller maintained the approach that got him started, borrowing heavily, reinvesting profits, controlling costs tightly, and keeping close watch on the sources and growth of demand. By the end of 1866, he'd formed a partnership with his brother William, who owned another Cleveland refinery. Together, they had the largest oil refinery business in the world. John was just 27. 4 years later, in 1870, that partnership was dissolved, and John formed the company that was to be forever associated with his name, Standard Oil. He then embarked upon the business modus operandi that simultaneously endeared him to oil consumers, but earned him the envy and much more often the bitter criticism of competitors. One after another, he bought out 22 of his 26 Cleveland rivals in barely 4 months during 1872. He saw himself as the savior of a fragmented, costly, and inefficient industry. He built economies of scale that allowed him to undercut competitors and deliver an affordable product to ordinary people. By the end of the decade, Standard Oil was refining over 90% of US oil production, and Rockefeller was a millionaire. In 1879 dollars, that's about $32.3 million now. Yet, this was also the time in which, as he commented later, "All the fortune that I have made has not served to compensate me for the anxiety of that period." newspaper and politicians rounded on Standard Oil's monopolistic business practices. This anger was sharpened when in 1882, the 41 individual corporations that Rockefeller needed in order to operate across numerous states were grouped under a novel construct and renamed the Standard Oil Trust. It was called a trust, but effectively was a corporation of corporations, roughly equivalent to a modern holding company. While streamlining management and control, however, it also focused the attention of Rockefeller's growing number of critics, especially politicians. Consequently, 1882 marked the peak of Standard Oil's dominance. Rockefeller realized that the public would no longer accept a monopoly in the oil business. Besides, overseas oil producers and refiners proliferated as Russia, Burma, now called Myanmar, and Java, part of what is now Indonesia, entered the market. Meanwhile, the discovery of electricity and the light bulb spelled doom for oil-fired lighting, but the automobile had yet to come to oil's rescue. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act passed, encouraging individual states to mount their own attacks on monopolies. Ohio was one of the most aggressive, and in 1892, it forced the separation of the original company Standard Oil of Ohio from the rest of the group. That same decade saw John D. begin to withdraw from day-to-day management of his business. By the time of his full retirement in 1901, age 63, he'd made $58 million, about $2 billion today. It would have been much more if it hadn't been for his prodigious philanthropy. Even in his first job as an assistant bookkeeper, he donated 6% of his earnings to charity, much of that related to the Baptist Church. Over his lifetime, it's estimated he gave away $540 million. What can the ambitious modern businessman or entrepreneur learn from the life of this remarkable man? Above all, he embodies the first principle of success in money-making, and that is focus. In our profile of Ralph Lauren and our video on making a million, it was emphasized again and again that without razor-sharp concentration on your goal, you cannot hope to succeed. That single-mindedness may make you dull, even unpleasant, company for others. Rockefeller was, as we've learned, the very antithesis of controversial wit or warmth. He saw himself as doing God's work. Richest of all time? Very probably, and certainly in terms of how his wealth compared with the contemporary American economy. Greatest philanthropist ever? Also very likely. But was he a role model for success? That must depend on you.